Sometimes, to understand what matters most, we have to look back at how it all began. The history of Catholic education in Sandhurst is a story of people, ordinary and extraordinary, who gave everything to build something lasting. In this opening episode of Catholic Education Matters, hosts Kate Fogarty and Jenni Kennedy from Catholic Education Sandhurst take us on a journey through the extraordinary and often untold history of Catholic education, from its humble beginnings with the First Fleet to the establishment of schools across rural Australia. In this episode, we explore how the first Catholic school was started in 1820 with just one teacher and 1 penny per student, the role of Reverend Dr. Henry Bacchus, Bishop Martin Crane, and the religious orders in shaping early education across regional Victoria, the Defence of Government Schools High Court case, and why Sandhurst became the national focus, and the shift to modern governance and the lasting legacy of holistic education. Whether you're an educator, a parent, or simply someone curious about how Catholic education evolved in Australia, this episode offers a compelling look at where we've come from and where we're headed next. Now join us as we explore what truly matters in education.
Well, hello everyone, and welcome to our very first podcast of Catholic Education Matters. This is a brand new podcast brought to you by Catholic Education Sandhurst, and we're going to explain what that is in a little while. My name's Kate Fogarty. I'm the Executive Director at Catholic Education Sandhurst, and I'm joined today by my colleague, Jenni Kennedy, who is our Communications Manager.
Hello, Kate. Thank you for inviting me to be part of the conversation. As you know, we're both passionate about Catholic education and the history, particularly here in this patch in the Sandhurst Diocese. And we're going to have a conversation about some of the things that have happened over the years, and hopefully people will learn a little bit more about a place that we really love.
It is exciting to have this conversation. I know you're one of our best storytellers, so this is going to be a lot of fun. So the purpose of this very first podcast is really to set a bit of a scene. And we thought there's probably a lot of people listening to our podcasts who don't know a lot about Catholic education, or perhaps don't know a lot about how the different systems here in Australia operate, Catholic, independent and government. So we're going to tease out a little bit of that. We're going to explain a bit about the history of Catholic education, some parts through the whole national story, but in other parts more particularised to our little part of the world. And hopefully that'll help situate what we're about and why we think Catholic education matters, and why this podcast is really not just for those who work in Catholic education or who are impacted by Catholic education, but in fact for anybody who's interested in education. So will we get started, Jen?
We'll get started.
Awesome. Well, we thought, right, if we're going to do this properly, we're going right back, and we're not going to assume that people know anything. So we're going to stop, we're going to explain some terms, we're going to make sure we really tell this story in a way that people who are coming to it for the very first time can really understand what's happening. So let's go right back. Let's do First Fleet.
Wow,
okay,
we
I know.
are going right
We
back.
are not mucking around. So some people will be aware of this, or most Australians will be aware of this, but the First Fleet arrived in Australia in 1788. Of course, there'd been people here for tens and tens and tens of thousands of years before that, but the First Fleet with those big amount of convicts came in 1788. There were 732 convicts on the First Fleet. And amongst those convicts, there were 22 children, 11 of whom were actually born on the trip out from England. Like, quite extraordinary lives for those little people, I think. Now, of all of those convicts, about half of those were born in Ireland. And of course, the very vast majority of those were Catholic.
Of course they were.
They were sent here for all sorts of different things, but largely because they were poor and debt-ridden people who did a lot of things to try and establish their own independence, and weren't particularly successful about with that relative to the state authorities. So they all arrived in 1788, but in fact it wasn't until 1800, 12 years later, that the first Catholic priests arrived in Australia. So over those first 12 years, those convicts attended the Church of England services. I'm sure there was some disgruntlement about that at the time, but that's the way it was, and at least there was a recognition that the spiritual needs of those people was important. And those first priests, there were 3 of them, they were all sent out as convicts. They weren't free settlers. They were sent here for complicity in the 1798 rebellion in Ireland, all leaders in their own right. It was Father James Howard, Father James Dixon and Father Peter O'Neill, and all 3 of them arrived as convicts, but only one of them, Father Dixon, was conditionally emancipated to be able to say Mass for the convicts. So from 1800, for a short time, he was able to lead services, lead masses for the convicts and for others who were here who were Catholic, because of course some of the soldiers who'd been sent out were Catholic, and some of the free settlers who had to come early were also Catholic. But in fact in 1804, just 4 years later, that permission was revoked because there had been another insurrection here in the colony. And no masses were allowed then until 1820, when the first priests arrived of their own free will. And that was the first time they were officially allowed to travel to the colony to minister to the Catholics who were here, both as prisoners and free settlers by that point in time. 1820 is also significant, Jen, because it's the time that the first Catholic school started. So some people had obviously come out at different times with the various fleets and had started little schools or were running very little kind of cottage schools, if you like, throughout the colony. But in 1820, the first lay person who was a Catholic. Now, lay person means somebody who's not a priest. He's an ordinary person, but he was a Catholic. His name was George Morley, and he started the first school in the colonies for Catholic students, and he was paid 1 penny per student. Isn't that great?
It's a handsome sum.
Isn't it? We talk about funding issues today. He was certainly doing it at the tough end of the spectrum. And his first school, which was actually later handed over to the Marist brothers, who then it grew quite considerably under them. We'll talk a little bit more about the religious orders later on. It initially had 31 students, some of whom were Protestant. So right from that very first Catholic school in the early colonies in Sydney, non-Catholics were schooled in Catholic schools. So a strong tradition that started very, very early in Catholic history, which is pretty cool. So from that one school, over the next 20 or so years, we had a really quick spring up of another 10 or so Catholic schools in the Sydney area. The first Catholic school was established in Melbourne in 1840. And it was also run by lay people, even though it was established by a priest. And this is really how Catholic schools got going. So a priest would move to an area or be sent to an area, and then they would find a good person with no training to start up the school, and people would give a bit of money and they'd find a room and things would kick off. Which brings us, Jen, to the goldfields, which is not too long after that. We're in 1850s. I'm going to hand over to you for the next part of our story.
This is a big part and probably a well-known part of our story. You know, the goldfields of Bendigo were so rich. So much gold was found.
Literally rich.
Yeah,
a lot
really,
of gold.
It really was. And it was gold fever. And with gold fever comes people who were in seeking their fortune. And, you know, tens of thousands of people flocked to the area, and along with those people came children. And there are lots of children on the goldfields that had no schooling available to them. And so really they were just running wild, if for want of a better term. And not long after the gold was found in the Bendigo region, that's where our first Catholic priest in the Sandhurst stories enters. And that was Dr. Henry Bacchus, who arrived in 1852. And he was the first Catholic priest on the goldfields. And he was an extraordinary man and a very big part of the history of the Sandhurst diocese, because beyond being someone who was really visionary, he was also a man of the people, and he was a very astute investor. So he bought beautiful parcels of land and really looked after the people. But he was one of to notice that there weren't any schools, and so he converted his chapel, which was basically just a tent, and he turned that into the first Catholic school in the Bendigo goldfields, and that would be called St Killian's later on. But it was really just some boxes on the ground and some planks across it, and students would come during the day and he would teach them himself initially.
And then I think he had a lay person come and help him too. So that same story kind of unfolding there. I think I've read he had 30 students, 1/3 of whom were non-Catholics as well. So even here in our own part of the world, you know, a strong start to the idea that Catholic schools are for everybody. We have a way of being us that we invite people into, and even Henry Bacchus was all about that. So quite a remarkable man, and as you say, we're absolutely astute at buying property, and something that we still benefit from today here in the Bendigo region. I might just mention while we're in this space, Bendigo wasn't always known as Bendigo, was it, Jen? It was actually called Sandhurst before it was Bendigo.
Yeah. It was. So gold was initially found on the Bendigo Creek. So that was a creek that was named after a local boxer who boxed in the style of an English boxer whose name was Abednego, and that was where became an iteration of that to
so
become
Bendigo Creek. Town of Sandhurst.
Yes.
Wasn't always called It was something else before Sandhurst.
Yeah, it was called Castleton, so right back in the day. So it's had a few different names, but Bendigo was the popular name, and that's what we still call it today.
There was a vote. That's right.
There was a local vote.
That's right. But the Catholic diocese is still refers to Sandhurst. So we are the Diocese of Sandhurst, and hence why our organisation is called Catholic Education Sandhurst. So hopefully that's filled a little gap for people who've wondered why, because I think every other diocese in Australia, of which there are dozens and dozens, are all named after the major town in their part of the world, but we're the anomaly in that, with a name that nobody recognises and wonders where we are.
People are wondering where the Sandhurst Diocese is. Well, we're really across the top of Victoria, and we extend from Kerrang in the northwest, and we take in central Victoria and some great, beautiful, vibrant towns, lots of lovely little ones, but ports of Echuca and, of course, Shepparton and Wangaratta and Bendigo. And then we go all the way across where to Kate?
We go past Wodonga up to Corryong, up in the northeast, up in the high country, beautiful snowy man from Snowy River kind of country, a fabulous part of the world. So we've got wineries, we've got high country, we've got the beautiful Murray River and all of the life that is led along there, and of course wonderful Bendigo with its great gold rush history. So lots of great towns and wonderful people across the Sandhurst Diocese and our part of the world. In terms of our schools, we've got little primary schools, tiny little ones with 16 students. We've got great big secondary schools with 2,000 students. We've got alternative schools for kids who require a different style of learning. And we've got kindergartens. We've got early learning centres. So we really are birth to 18 years old is what we at Catholic Education Sandhurst take responsibility for, with our wonderful leaders in our schools and all of the staff who work alongside us.
Yeah, we're really blessed. But maybe we need to go back again, Kate, because we've probably come back to the present, and we're really still back in the 1850s, because St Killian's has just been established, and of course other schools would follow really quickly over in Wangaratta and Heathcote and Beechworth, where gold again was a big factor in why these schools were being developed.
And some of them, I mean, they had a bit of government funding over this very early period, didn't they? There was some money flowing through from the governments to the priests, as it turned out, who were starting these schools and really leading these schools.
Yeah, they did, but that was all to end really soon after. So in 1872, the Education Act came in, which really changed that dramatically, and it was around that whole notion now that school was to be compulsory and secular, and therefore the funding for Catholic schools was to cease from that moment forward.
And we should be particular here. This is Victoria, of course. There is no national government at this point in time. Federation doesn't occur until another 30 years away, 1901. So way back in the day. So we're gonna do another jump now. So Catholic schools got up and running. They were largely started by priests out in the little towns or in the suburbs of the bigger cities. They would invite lay people, just ordinary people who didn't have teacher training. Hopefully they were literate, a little bit numerate, and were teaching the students and setting up a bit of a curriculum. And there was a bit of a state curriculum, but not a tremendously developed one. And then really the state funding ends around the same time that Sandhurst gets a new bishop. Do you want to talk to us a little bit about our new bishop?
Yeah, the first bishop of Sandhurst was Bishop Martin Crane, and he was an Augustinian bishop who travelled over from Ireland, and he would be installed as the first bishop of Sandhurst. And of course, the Sandhurst was developed at that time as well. So it was a time when the Catholic system started to take charge and decide that really if we were going to operate within all of the other parameters, that we actually had to be established. And so the Sandhurst Diocese was established along with Ballarat and Melbourne at the time, and Bishop Crane was installed as our first bishop. Now, Bishop Crane was quite an extraordinary man, and he came over on a boat with his cousin, who was Stephen Revel, who was a father at the time, and he would later become the second bishop of Sandhurst. Just a little anecdote about Bishop Crane that people may not know is that he really struggled with his sight during his time here, and so at one of his trips back to Ireland, and he made many of them, but one of them he sought advice from a surgeon for his failing eyesight. And what is thought to be a premature operation for cataracts resulted in complete blindness. And so that was something that he really struggled with, but he still got back on a boat and he came back to Australia and he lived out his time here as the Bishop of Sandhurst. It's really, really amazing.
And this is, the history of Catholic education, like all the school sectors in a country like Australia, is really quite remarkable and has these real giants who just, burst onto the scene and do an amazing job and really take whatever exists to the next level. It's so true that, when we say we stand on the shoulders of giants, it's people like Bishop Crane that we stand on the shoulders of. Now, when he was heading back to Ireland, one of the reasons he was heading back is because this 1872 withdrawal of government funding had happened. There was a need to start finding, a good number of teachers for these schools and leaders for these schools. And the Catholic Church's solution to this has been the same, irrespective of where people are around the world. It's go to the home country, go to where the religious orders have been established and invite them to send out some teachers. So in Ireland, in France, there were already very established Catholic teaching religious orders, brothers and nuns, sisters, who were teaching to the people in their local area but had also been invited out to other parts of the world. And now the Australian bishops start really taking advantage of that. So Bishop Crane goes and he invites a number of the religious orders to send out people and quite a few of them arrive here in Sandhurst. So Jen, tell us a little bit about some of these brothers and sisters who came out of the old countries, came out of France, came out of Ireland and came and moved to the dusty plains of Bendigo and surrounds to start schools.
Well, it was absolutely a leap of faith, wasn't it? They got on these boats and most of them would never return to their homeland, and they would have known that at that point, that this was where they had been called to go. And they arrived in Australia and they were not prepared for the conditions that awaited them. They had gone from probably Irish winters that was extreme cold into really hot days in Australia that could have hovered around the 40-degree mark. We know exactly what that's like. And there was no compensation for them or adaptation of what the clothes they were wearing. They had to wear the clothes that they bought, and they were geared up for these cold winters. And so they really battled. They rolled up their sleeves and they came into communities and they created schools and they invited people into these communities, and they were just these wondrous people. Probably one of the really big things that was new to them was the tyranny of distance. Australia is so spread out, and they arrived wherever they came by boat, and then they had to find their ways to these small communities, and that was no mean feat.
And quite a lot of organisation from the bishop and, his senior priests, I would have thought, to try and establish, okay, this town is now ready for a secondary school. Let's send some Marist brothers there. Or this town needs another team to be working in the primary school. Let's send some Mercy sisters or some Brigidine sisters once they arrive and get these schools up and running. So great leap of faith, but also foresight and thinking from the people here on the ground to really, establish where the next school needed to be. And over those, 70 or 80 years from the 1780s, 1790s, when Crane was bringing out these religious orders through until 1950, the growth of schools here in Sandhurst was just exponential. In fact, by 1950, there were 29 primary schools and 16 secondary schools. We don't even have that many Catholic secondary schools today. So, just phenomenal growth of big Catholic families, big farming families largely, moving out to these towns, establishing themselves over many generations in these towns and really helping to build Catholic education because, of course, no government funding, right? So this is families, this is the Lamington Drives, this is the everybody on for the working bees, this is everybody giving that little bit extra in the plate or that little bit of money to the schools so that the actual buildings could be built, but also so that there was some money for the people in these religious orders, because while they weren't paid a full wage, which was another part of the big attraction of bringing them out, they were a little bit trained and they didn't draw a full wage because they were supported by their religious order. These schools could run very, very cheaply comparative to today, but they were quite amazing places. Secondary schools running enormous curriculums, very timely curriculums of their time, but very timely and progressive. Jen, you've got some good stories about some of the curriculums.
Yeah, they were so accomplished. You know, the sisters would teach a whole range of things, and they had to subsidise the schools by taking in students for music, or perhaps it was sewing, or they were preparing them in the ways of ladylike behaviour or deportment, as we might call it. And they would prepare students to go on to higher education as well. They were so accomplished, and they had to know a whole range of subjects and to be able to teach that with such skill. And if you flash forward a little bit forward, and they started to bring in the science labs, well, some of them were starting at night to get science degrees after working all day, after getting the boarders up and doing the meals, and also making sure that the lessons were had, and then probably putting them to bed and then starting their study at night. So, you know, they worked so hard.
And easy to imagine, like they're working hard, that there might be some payoff for this, but these are not salubrious accommodations they're in either. I mean, today you drive through these country towns and it can look like these beautiful big buildings on the Catholic school sites, on not all of them, but on some of them, and think, oh, gee, they lived a pretty majestic life. But in fact, they were up with the dawn, but also they were monitoring the borders. You know, they were making sure these kids had everything that they needed. They were keeping them busy noon to night. They were preparing their classes for the next day. A lot of them ran farms as well, so that they could bring in some income and some food for the students. It was such a life of full service, and so many of them did it so willingly and did such a magnificent job raising people who would become extremely influential in their local communities and the Australian community at large. You know, a lot of very prominent Australians came through these Catholic secondary schools and Catholic primary schools, and have contributed to our land in ways that we just can barely even measure. So the debt that we owe these people who over many generations came out largely from Europe, not always, and then others who joined them, young men and women here in Australia who joined the religious orders and kept up those traditions and kept those schools in very rural areas running, so that rural young people had access to a quality education, you know, is something that we can't help but be extremely grateful for. It was a really amazing part of Australia's history.
It certainly wasn't it. What you were talking, it reminded me of this photo that's quite famous in our diocese, and it's of the Franciscan Missionary of Divine Motherhood sisters who were in Nathalia. And there's this photo where they're digging the trenches for the school. There's about 6 of them, and they're all in full habits. They're on the shovel, and they're all working hard. It's
glorious.
It's an amazing photo.
Yeah.
But the folklore is, and I have on good account, is that they dug the trenches in the wrong space. And so I like to fancy that they just posed for the photo, and then they got about filling in the trenches and they dug them in the right place. But it just shows, it really... Yeah,
they gave it all.
They gave everything. They really did.
Yeah, it's one of the saddest things you can do is journey through the country towns where so many of these schools lived, and pop into the cemetery and just see how many of these religious young people passed away quite early because of the privations and the difficulty of life, and just not having access to the medical care because they didn't have the finances to send the person to Melbourne or wherever it might be for the care that they needed. It's quite an extraordinary set of circumstances that led to that very exponential growth of Catholic education, not just here in Sandhurst, but in fact right around Australia. But of course it couldn't continue, and in the 1960s the religious orders just weren't attracting the numbers that they had been, and so these lovely cheap employees and teachers just weren't around in the numbers that they were, and schools needed to start employing lay people. So the priest in the local community or the religious order who were running the schools suddenly needed to be finding quite a bit more money to be able to entice teachers to move to the area, to support them in that move and potentially their family, and also to pay them a living wage. So by the 1960s, late 1960s, things were really getting tight in schools, and with no government funding, things came to a flashpoint in Goulburn in New South Wales. So Jen, I'm going to hand over to you for this wonderful story.
Who would have thought that funding would come to a head because of a set of toilets? But that's exactly what happened. And the Goulburn strike in 1962 was a pivotal time in changing the landscape of funding for education, because what happened was a school inspector came in and told the local Catholic school that they needed 3 extra toilets to be able to cater for the number of students that they had. And of course they didn't have the money to do that. So what they did, and it's well documented, is that they closed the school. In fact, the bishop gave permission for all the schools in Goulburn to close, and there are about 2,000 students that were currently enrolled in Catholic schools. And so then they had to re-enroll them in the state system, which of course was already stretched and struggling to keep up with the demand for education. And so there weren't enough space.
Can you imagine them all rolling up on day one of the year? Oh, it's another, 50 kids to enrol. Where are we going to put these guys?
There were about 630 spots available and with 2,000 students. So all they could do was have a lottery. So basically there was a ballot held as to whether your child got a place at the school or not. So of course it wrapped up fairly quickly, but the point was made. And of course there was lots of national debate about it and a huge amount of media exposure as well, which started the change. So that was the catalyst really for something really dramatic to happen, knowing that the systems needed to coexist and that funding needed to be provided to make that happen.
Yeah, so Goulburn strikes 62. In 67 here in Victoria, and we'll just stick with Victoria for now because it gets a bit complicated if we take on all of the states. But in 67, the then Premier, Henry Bolte, the famous Henry Bolte, he allocated the first state aid that was to commence in schools, and then Commonwealth funding was promised to start in 69, which it did. And then by 72, Prime Minister, so now we're going national, Gough Whitlam introduced needs-based funding for schools. So a really significant uptick, and I think a lot of science labs came in as part of that particular burst of funding. And in 73, the Carmel report was handed down, which recommended a departure from dollar-for-dollar grants, so really opened up the opportunity for non-government schools to be able to be funded appropriately to their need. And Commonwealth aid was established on the back of the Carmel report in 74. So over a relatively short period of time, 5 years, things changed quite significantly in terms of funding for Catholic schools. And it was in 74 then with that first flush of money coming in from the federal government, which wasn't a huge amount, but it certainly made a difference, that Catholic Education Sandhurst started, Jen.
Yeah, we celebrated 50 years of the office last year, and that was a chance to really reflect back on that time. And of course, they needed some education consultants because the priests at the time didn't have the knowledge to be able to run schools. And so that's where our first two education consultants were appointed, and that was Adrian Sexton, who was based in Bendigo, and Jim McKenna was based in Benalla, and they set about servicing all the schools.
I just want to put the picture around this. So you've got in every little town, you've got the parish priest, so a man who's been trained to minister to the people as a pastoral leader, not as a school leader, employing a principal and then working in conjunction with that principal, sometimes for better or for worse on both sides, to get that school up and running, keep it operating, make sure it's operating under the state legislation that it needed to, but also doing a lot of the fundraising that needed to happen. So these priests very often not professionally trained for a career other than being a priest. So running a school and the business associated with running a school is completely alien to them. So wonderful in 74 to now have two whole people across the diocese to support the principals and the priests to make sure the schools were meeting their obligations and progressing as they should.
And these great men were so committed to Catholic education, and they had to buy their own car. So the distance of our diocese is quite vast, and the only way that you can really support these communities and these schools is to get in the car and go there. And so that's what they did. But Adrian Sexton tells the story that he bought his own car at his own personal cost, and 6 weeks later he had a kangaroo and had to buy another one.
Car. Oh my goodness.
I know. So you can imagine the sacrifices that they made to be able to see the vision for the system that it was going to become, and that's what they did under the guidance of Monsignor Peter de Campo, who would become the first unofficial, I guess you could say, director of Catholic education. And he was an extraordinary man who really gave them the ability to be able to go and do their work while he handled all of the more political side of what needed to be done.
Absolutely. And just deeply committed to the idea that every child in every rural town, no matter how small or big, deserved a quality education and was just there for that and prioritising that at every step of the way. So it just said, Jen, in a very short period of time, the Catholic sector's gone from no funding to funding and then a little bit of a skeleton staff around. Here's how we are. But I imagine there was some opposition to that. I can't imagine, that money flowed without some issues and concerns being raised.
Yeah, and truer words have never been spoken. As soon as money started to come, there was a group formed we called the Dogs, and it was basically the defence of government schools was the acronym. And they established themselves in 1965 and ran a race for a really long time to try and challenge the fact that if religious schools were getting government funding and they were spending this money on religious instruction in schools, that they were being unconstitutional, and that's what they set about proving. And that's where the Sandhurst diocese actually comes into the story, and most people won't realise the role that the Sandhurst diocese
because
played.
this was a federal argument, wasn't it? Like it wasn't a Victorian state, government issue. It was a national argument that religious schools, be that Catholic or independent, and all of the other religious groups who started schools around Australia, not just Catholics, we just happened to be the biggest, that there was misuse of the funds, that it was being used to propagate the faith, that it was being used to prop up the parish, that money was being diverted from the schools into the parishes. And that it was essentially being misused, government funding being misused. So, yes, Sandhurst gets its little moment in the sun here in quite the quirkiest way. Tell us about it, Jen.
Yeah, well, the bishop at the time was Bishop Stewart, and he'd been really outspoken on a political scale and had been quite influential in local...
Big voice in Victorian...
in local elections and really had swayed some of the outcomes, particularly here in Bendigo. And so... the Dogs as a group decided they would take this fight all the way to the High Court. So to make sure that the case was going to be as airtight as possible and they were going to get the result that they wanted, they chose a diocese that they thought would be most likely to be misappropriating the funds or using them in an unconstitutional way, and that was the Sandhurst diocese. And it was largely because Bishop Stewart had such a strong voice, and so that's why they decided that they would subpoena 97 members, principals and parish priests of schools in the Sandhurst diocese were all subpoenaed on the same day and to appear in the court to defend,
in Melbourne.
In Melbourne. And it was quite an extraordinary. It was orchestrated in a way that it was on a public holiday in Melbourne. It was Melbourne Show Day, and so the Dogs knew this, and their defence knew this, was that they wouldn't have any access to their lawyers that were based in Melbourne on the day because they'd all be having a day off. And so that was the day they subpoenaed. And you can just picture what was happening in every parish in the Sandhurst diocese as subpoena after subpoena came in. And Adrian Sexton recalls that he's sitting at his desk and the phone was running hot.
Because I think it was quite orchestrated, wasn't it? Like a lot of planning had gone into that. Yes. They would all be delivered at the exact same moment. I'm not sure whether it was like 10 a.m. or 11 a.m., but everybody got a knock on their door, all 97 people, parish priests and principals, and were issued these subpoenas. So I can imagine, Adrian's phone rang hot pretty quickly.
Yeah. At that time, it was the largest number of subpoenas the High Court had ever handed out. So it was really just this world event.
And, of course, not a public holiday in Sandhurst. We're in the country. We wouldn't take Melbourne Show Day. So everybody was at school. So quite a public thing too to happen. And the priests would have all been, at work in their parish house. So, really a really big statement being made straight up by subpoenaing all of these people on the assumption that because the bishop was quite right-wing and very outspoken, that he would have instructed the priests and the principals to use the funds in a particular way that wasn't in keeping with the legislation. So that was the premise. So 90-something of them subpoenaed to go down to Melbourne, but they didn't all have to go, did they, in the end? There was a bit of common sense.
I think there were about 15 of them that took the stand. Of course, the key players, Bishop Stewart was there, Monsignor Peter DeCampo, Monsignor Duffus, and of course Jim McKenna and Adrian Sexton were there, and some of the priests and religious, some of the sisters were there as well.
And some of the principals, I think, too.
Yeah. And I must say at this point that the issue of accountability and the government funding wasn't taken for granted. And so it was taken really seriously by everyone. But I think the nature of Monsignor Peter DeCampo being quite quite relaxed about it all was that they knew that they were not misappropriating the funds, that the funds were being used for what they needed to be used for. And 100% defend the right of the dogs as well to look into that and to make sure that that it was being used for, because they honestly believe that it wasn't.
Yeah. So, okay, the trial starts and the dogs have got a really capable lawyer who's going to try and put these priests and other leaders through their paces to try and determine where the money's going. So what happened, Jen?
So when Monsignor Peter de Campo took the stand, I think it was starting to get a little bit frustrated, the council at this stage, and he said to him, "Oh, for goodness sake, how often has Bishop Stewart been into your school?" Thinking, I believe it was probably a daily occurrence. And Monsignor thought for a little while and he said, "Well, I have two schools. I have St Peter's in North Bendigo and I have St Killian's in Bendigo. And Bishop Stewart visited one of them about 6 years ago, and I think in the last 3 years he'd visited one of the others." So it became apparent really quickly that Bishop Stewart was not spending time in the schools at all and therefore was not misappropriating the funds for the reasons of religious education. It was really being used for what it was meant to be used for.
My reading of the notes is that, basically it was witness after witness got up and really said, no, here's how the money's being spent. We can account for it right down to the last dollar. Here's, completely appropriately that the priests weren't overly involved in the schools. In fact, in some cases were very, very, very not involved in the schools. So really the case kind of fell over pretty quickly, didn't it?
Yeah, and I think McPhee, who was the counsel at the time or was the barrister, had been assured that this would actually be a really easy case for him to win. It would be a hands down win, and so he was overheard in the passage by our people who were there. He was an ex-military man, so this will probably give some more context into his rant. But he said, "First you gave me the general, which of course was Bishop Stewart, and he knows nothing. Then you gave me the captain, which was Monsignor Peter de Campo, and he said, 'See the staff sergeant,' which was Mons Duffus, and he knows nothing. Then I find out the diocese is being run by a couple of Lance corporals," which of course was Adrian Sexton and Jim McKenna, because when Monsignor Peter had been cross-examination, Peter de Campo, he said, the council said to him, "Do you have anything to do with schools?" And he said, "No." Do you employ teachers?" "No." "Do you employ principals?" "No." And the council said, "It seems that you're very much a part-time director. Do you discuss education matters with the bishop?" "Very little," he said. "How often has Bishop Stewart been to your school?" And that was the story that we just told. "Not very often at all." So it was a case of, we took the funding. We were grateful. There was an element of appreciation for the funding, and it was taken seriously and it was used appropriately. So
and as we mentioned earlier, very necessary, because now there were lay teachers who needed to be employed. Schools were being regulated much more closely. There were standards that had to be met. Toilet blocks had to be the right size with the right number of toilets. Premises needed to be safe. So, over that time, as you would expect, the 70s and 80s, the requirements on schools lifted, and so the cost associated with running schools lifted, and that government funding really did help Catholic schools to be able to achieve those responsibilities.
Because the conditions weren't great for anyone. So even the sisters that were coming out from overseas were finding that the buildings were cold, they were drafty. Often there were no concrete floors or anything that resembled anything other than dirt, and conditions were really tough. And so this funding was used to make sure that the system was more robust and able to look after the children and the people who were working in their schools as well.
And as Goulburn had established, the government sector schools were just simply not large enough to be able to assume responsibility for all of the children who were in Catholic education, which by the 70s, 80s, 90s is, it's around 25% of the huge number of kids in schools across Australia. It's back closer to 20% now. But, at that time, a quarter of kids being educated in Catholic education. And while there are some schools that are extremely well resourced in some parts of the country, in country towns, the Catholic primary school and the Catholic secondary schools are, just good, wonderful spaces where the facilities are the best that we can make them, but they're not big flash centres like some people expect Catholic and independent schools to be.
And we can really thank all of the directors along the time. Adrian Sexton will go on to be the first lay director, and he really said about establishing an education system with good people around him who are able to advise. And then Dennis Higgins was our next director after him, who was extraordinary again in that funding debate, but also just a creative and visionary leader. And
very much a man of his time, really interacted with what was happening in education and what the latest research was around what works best for schools, really dedicated to that.
Yeah, and Philomena Billington was the first female director, and she was so passionate about every aspect of Sandhurst, but also brought a beautiful lens of that religious lens where she was quite extraordinary in her field, and she influences like so much of the source of life and the way that we do teach religious education in our schools.
That's right. And then of course Paul Desmond, who was here really carrying on the fabulous work of Philomena and Dennis and Adrian before him, but also brought the diocese through the tumultuous years of the pandemic and really allowed the place to hold together at a time when it was very difficult to do that. And also was the director at the time that the diocese became a company. So, and we need to kind of explore this a little bit because this is another big shift in how Catholic education works here in Victoria. But as many of you would know, the Royal Commission into Institutional Child Abuse was inaugurated in the late teens and was an extremely important and extensive examination of child sexual and physical and emotional abuse that happened in a number of institutions, but particularly in schools, and quite importantly and necessarily particularly in Catholic schools and across Catholic parishes as well. And a number of findings came out of that Royal Commission that have really shifted the way that not just we in the Catholic sector, but in fact all sectors really set themselves up as safe places for children in the modern era. But one of the really big findings for the Catholic school sector was that it was inappropriate moving forward for each school to be run by the parish priest. That clearly, while these people were good people trying to do their best in a local community, they didn't have the skills, the knowledge, the expertise and the networks and the resources to be able to ensure that children's safety was assured. So in Victoria, each of the dioceses, the 4 dioceses, so ourselves in Sandhurst, Melbourne, Ballarat and Sale, all established companies. In fact, Sale went a little bit before everybody else, but basically a company was established under the ownership of the bishop. So he's the owner of the company. He appoints a board of very experienced people, so educators and other people with important expertise for schools. So, everything from capital planning, legal expertise, safeguarding expertise, a whole range of different skills, financial expertise to sit on that board. And then they appoint people like myself and yourself, Jen, and the team that we have to support the schools and to lead the schools. And this was really the shift that happened at incorporation. For us here in Sandhurst, it was in 2021, so right in the middle of the pandemic when Paul Desmond was the executive director. And the shift was really that instead of being a diocese of schools where the schools were connected to each other, really by virtue of the fact that we were all under the same bishop, now we were also within the same company. So the decisions that we can make as a company, the way that we can act as an ecosystem of schools who are supporting the best for every student is a real shift in what happens in Catholic education across the diocese. And for us here in Sandhurst, it's been a game changer in the way we've been able to assure that every child in every school on every day and every teacher has what they need to do the very best. There's no longer a sense that the tiny little schools might have to miss out because they don't have the resourcing that they once did, or that the large schools are getting too unwieldy because they don't have enough of the support around them that we can now wrap around all of our schools. So some really exciting new initiatives came with incorporation. And that really brings us to today where, where we are a school system of 51 schools, 5 early learning centres, about to be 6 early learning centres, which is very exciting. A couple of other new schools in the process of being built, and 2,800 wonderful staff who do an amazing job day in, day out for the young people in this part of the world. And Catholic education, really has had something to offer, not just Sandhurst, but the whole of Australia, and continues to do so. Because we have such good people who come and work with us to build a better life for the children.
I'd like to acknowledge Bishop Shane McKinlay in this process as well, because he realised that the best way forward was to take everyone with him as well, and there was really strong consultation throughout the diocese, all stakeholders, to find the best governance program or the best governance model for this diocese, and at the same time to establish a company for our Sandhurst Catholic Early Childhood Education and Care, which is such a beautiful part of our diocese. But of course, we had actually had a kindergarten back in the 1960s over in Shepparton, so we have a history of early childhood. But the establishment of both companies moving forward under the guidance of some really great people, two separate boards, and of course Bishop Shane McKinlay as the person who's really driven all of this, along with Father Brian Boyle, who is our Episcopal Vicar for Education. We thank them greatly for the role that they've played in it.
Interested in what we do, and so supportive of what we're all trying to do for the students and the leaders and the staff in our schools. So Jen, as we come to the end of our podcast, the question we're going to be asking everyone at the end of each podcast is, what matters? Given what we've just spoken about, given the history that we've just told and the stories that we've shared, for you, what matters in what we've talked about today?
For me, it's really simple. It's about building on the foundation of Catholic education, remembering the people that went before us and the hardships, but also the triumphs of all of that, learning from some of the things that perhaps didn't go so well, and being the strongest, most robust system that we can, that is inviting all people into our communities, those who seek our values, knowing that our communities have a lot to offer, and hoping that people will come and look at our schools and find a place where they really belong and a part of a community that loves them. So that's what matters to me in Catholic education.
Oh, thank you. For me, we're recording this just as Term 2 is about to start for 2025, and our staff are in the middle of 3 days of professional learning, not just our teaching staff, but our allied staff as well, and their commitment to what they do and to how they experience Catholic education and the way they want to grow our schools so that every child might live life to the full, John 10:10, so that we all might have life to the full. I think, as is always what drives me and what I think is what is important about Catholic education, but it really doubles down for me on a day like today when we hear these stories and think about the tremendous legacy that we have that's been passed down to us. I said earlier, we stand on the shoulders of giants, and we really do, whether you're the most experienced teacher or leader that we have, or just new into Catholic education, or you're a parent who's choosing to send your child to one of our schools. We have had handed down to us this amazing spirit of people who see the immense value in every child and the dignity of every child, and want to create places of learning that inspire them to be the best version of themselves and inspire them to want to not just have life to the full for themselves, but in fact to build that for others as well. It's not just about each child in and of themselves, it's how they contribute to the world as they move forward in their lives. So these stories just inspire me. They give me courage to do what I need to do. And I hope as other people have heard these stories, of these tremendously ordinary people in extraordinary situations who just had the confidence and the courage and the other people around them to step forward and create the system that we've become today. And aren't we just so lucky for that? So thank you, Jen, for that great chat. And I hope to those of you who've had the opportunity to listen today that it has taught you a little bit about what Catholic education is in Australia and a little bit more of the story of who we are and what we do through the lens of Sandhurst Catholic education. And following on from this podcast, you're going to hear a lot more stories about what education's like in Australia, what are the influencing forces on us, why Catholic education has something very strong to contribute to that, and how we can all work together to create a place or a series of places and learning centres where young people can just absolutely thrive. So all the very best to everyone, and thanks again for listening.
Bye, everyone.
That's it for this episode of Catholic Education Matters. Make sure to follow the show and share it with someone who's passionate about learning, leadership and community. You can also leave a review or connect with us online at Catholic Education Sandhurst. Until next time, stay with us as we explore what truly matters in education.